Traveling as a first-class passenger on the world's largest ship meant being at the pinnacle of the empire. But this magnificent journey would end with a 15-second contact with an iceberg floating in the dark Atlantic waters at 11:40 p.m. on the night of April 14th, 1912. There were 324 first-class passengers aboard, but only 201 would see morning. So, what would you have felt if you were there? While floating in this imaginary luxury, how would you have behaved when the sinking ship pulled you into the icy waters of the Atlantic? Before we begin the video, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. Share in the comments which country you're watching from. So now, let's go together to Titanic's magnificent decks, to that unforgettable last voyage in history. Chapter 1. Magnificent Beginning. The giant silhouette rising through the morning mist of Southampton Harbor overshadowed everything your eyes had seen before. RMS Titanic's 4 funnels rose so high toward the English sky that you couldn't even see their tops without bending your neck. It was noon on April 10th, 1912. Hundreds of people around you were rushing about. Suitcases were being carried. Families were saying farewell. The ticket in your hand carried a value far beyond its weight, because this small piece of paper with the first-class stamp on it was equivalent to an ordinary worker's 7 years' earnings. It stood in your pocket, but your heart knew very well what this journey meant. As you moved toward the dock, your shoe polish gleamed in the morning sun. Your suit, crafted by London's finest tailor, fit your body so perfectly you could feel the quality of the fabric with each step. Third-class passengers passing by you were rushing towards the ship with paper bundles and worn suitcases in their hands. They were immigrants chasing new dreams in America. You, however, were taking this journey purely for pleasure. When you came beside the ship, you raised your head and looked. 9 decks rose upward, each floor's windows sparkling in the morning light. When you reached the first-class entrance, white uniformed officers greeted you. While your ticket was being checked, you looked around. Marble flooring, polished wood panels, crystal chandeliers. This wasn't a ship. It felt as if you were inside the Ritz Hotel. When one of the officers said he would escort you to your cabin, you nodded. You boarded the electric elevator. When you pressed the button, it began rising upward. Using an electric elevator in 1912 was a luxury in itself, but on Titanic, there were 3 different such elevators. When you got off on B deck, a long corridor stretched before you. The walls were covered with panels of shiny mahogany. The carpets were so soft under your feet you couldn't hear your steps. When the officer opened the cabin door, he stepped aside. The scene before you took your breath away. The room was more spacious and luxurious than many European hotels. In the center stood a large double bed, with ornate lamps made of brass at the headboard. The panels on the walls were decorated with hand-carved flower motifs. Daylight from the window illuminated the room. But the most surprising thing was having your own private bathroom. When you entered the bathroom, you encountered a marble sink, brass faucets, and a white porcelain bathtub. In that era, private bathrooms were very rare on ships. Most passengers had to use shared bathrooms. However, most of Titanic's first-class cabins had this comfort. When you turned on the faucet, fresh water flowed, not seawater, real fresh water. On the shelf next to the sink, expensive soaps and thick towels were arranged. You looked at yourself in the mirror. The expression on your face was mixed with excitement, pride, and slight uneasiness because you weren't actually accustomed to such luxury. When you returned to the cabin, you saw your suitcases had already been unpacked. Your personal valet was placing clothes in the wardrobes. He was a middle-aged, experienced-looking man. He displayed perfect grace even while moving. When he turned to you, he bowed slightly. Said he needed to prepare your tuxedo for dinner. You looked at your watch. It was noon. The ship would depart from port in an hour. When you approached the window, you could see people still rushing below. Families were making their final farewells. Children were crying. Handkerchiefs were waving. Just then, the ship's whistle roared so loudly that all of Southampton Harbor shook. The deep, hoarse sound repeated 3 times. This was the signal that the ship was ready to depart. Your heart began beating rapidly. From the window, you saw the dock slowly beginning to move away. The ship was of such enormous dimensions that it was difficult even to perceive it was moving. The crowd gathered on the dock continued waving to the ship. You also raised your hand and waved. The people below probably couldn't see you, but you said farewell anyway. When you left the cabin, it was time to begin exploring. In the corridor, other passengers from your class were strolling. Women wore magnificent hats and long dresses. Men in suits were chatting while smoking cigars. When you went up to A deck, you encountered the open-air deck. This was a special area reserved for first-class passengers. Wooden chairs, pots full of carefully tended flowers, deck chairs placed for watching the sea. When the sea breeze hit your face, you took a deep breath. The smell of salty air filled your lungs. When you approached the edge of the deck, you looked down. Southampton Harbor was getting smaller. The ship's propeller sounds came from below, but you couldn't even feel them this high up. Titanic was moving so smoothly, you could forget you were at sea. This giant structure, the length of 2 football fields, was moving gracefully despite its 46,328-ton weight. An elderly gentleman passing by, puffing his pipe, mentioned rumors that the ship was unsinkable. You laughed. Of course, such a large ship really couldn't sink, you thought. While wandering different parts of the deck, you noticed other wealthy passengers. You saw American millionaire John Jacob Astor. With his pregnant young wife, Madeline, he was examining the ship's luxury. Astor's fortune was measured in millions. He was considered one of the world's richest men. They too had boarded at Southampton, just like you experiencing the first moments of this magnificent journey. When you reached Cherbourg Harbor in the afternoon, the sun was beginning to set. The ship stopped here. There were new first-class passengers boarding from France. As you approached the dock, you saw small motorboats coming alongside. Titanic was too large to fit into Cherbourg Harbor. Therefore, passengers were being transported to the ship by small ferries. Among the new passengers waiting at the wharf were familiar figures. French nobles, wealthy businessmen. All were eager to climb aboard the ship's deck. When you returned to the cabin for dinner, you saw the valet had prepared the tuxedo. The clothes were carefully pressed, the bow tie tied, the shoes polished. While washing and dressing, you looked at yourself in the mirror. The tuxedo suited you very well. You straightened the tie, combed your hair, splashed on cologne. As you descended to the first-class dining room, the excitement in your heart was increasing because the first dinner would be one of the most magnificent meals eaten at sea. When you entered the dining room on D-deck, your mouth fell open. This hall, 114 feet long and 92 feet wide, was the largest room on any ship in 1912. Crystal chandeliers hanging from the ceiling, polished wooden columns, tables covered with white cloths. 554 people could eat here at the same time. The walls were covered with light-colored panels. The windows were made of leaded glass. Since it was evening, the windows were illuminated from behind. Thus you forgot you were in the dark sea. Felt as if you were eating at a luxury hotel on land. When you sat at your table, the scene before you was astonishing. 7 different forks, 6 glasses, mother-of-pearl spoons, silver knives. Each was designated for a different dish. When the waiter came, he gave you the menu. There were 11 different types of food. Oysters, salmon, consommé soup, beef made from filet, lamb chops, duck, eggplant, spinach soufflé, for dessert chocolate soufflé, French pastry, and cheese board. A separate waiter came to choose the wine. He asked whether you wanted French Burgundy or Bordeaux. When the meal began, you glanced at the tables around you. An elderly English couple sat on your right, the man in his military uniform, the woman sparkling with her diamond necklace. On your left, an American businessman was chatting with his family. They had a 6-year-old daughter, playing spoiled in her pink dress. At the front table sat Benjamin Guggenheim. He owned a mining empire. A lady was with him, but not his wife. Gossip immediately reached your ears. The orchestra was playing light music in the corner, while the sound of string instruments filled the dining room. Waiters moved silently. Each plate was presented as if it were a work of art. Oysters came on ice. Salmon was eye-catching with its pink color. The steak was perfectly cooked. Wine glasses were constantly full. Waiters filled them immediately before they emptied. Bread came fresh from the oven. Butter was brought from Denmark. Even salt was served in special crystal containers. The meal lasted 3 hours. Rest breaks were given between each plate because eating such rich foods consecutively was difficult. You met the gentleman at the neighboring table. He was coming from Philadelphia, operated a steel factory there. He talked about how the ship was an engineering marvel. He explained that Titanic had 16 watertight compartments. Even if 4 were damaged at once, it wouldn't sink. You listened, smiling. This information was reassuring. When dessert came, you were already very full. But the chocolate soufflé looked so delicious you couldn't refuse. A cheese board was also served. There were 12 different cheese varieties brought from France, Italy, and Switzerland. After finishing with coffee, it was time for the men to move to the lounge. While women would go to their own lounges, men would relax with cigars and whiskey. The men's lounge was furnished with thick leather chairs. Walls were covered with dark wood panels. The ceiling had classical-style plaster decorations. When the waiter came, he asked if you wanted Cuban cigars or Virginia tobacco. While drinking your whiskey, you listened to the conversations around you. Everyone was talking about stocks, investments, real estate. In one corner, a political debate was going on. In another corner, racehorses were being discussed. These were people at the pinnacle of the world. They were representatives of wealth, power, prestige. When the time approached midnight, you returned to the cabin. The valet had already made preparations. The bed was opened, pajamas prepared, toilet items placed in the washstand cabinet. When you looked out the window, you saw only darkness. Titanic was now in open seas. There was no land around. When you lay in bed, though you felt tired, your mind was still full of the day's events. This journey was exactly as you had imagined. Luxury, comfort, prestige, everything was perfect. When you closed your eyes, the ship's slight swaying put you to sleep. Tomorrow, other adventures would be waiting. Chapter 2, Life in the Middle of the Ocean. When the first rays of morning filtered through the window curtains, you opened your eyes. For a moment you had forgotten where you were. But then the ship's slight swaying reminded you of everything. You were on Titanic, in the middle of the Atlantic, on the world's most luxurious ship. The clock at your bedside showed 7 in the morning. Just then, the door was knocked lightly. The valet's polite voice was heard. When you gave him permission to enter, he was carrying a silver tray. On it was freshly brewed tea, croissant, butter, jam, and the morning newspaper. When you sat up straight in bed, The valet placed the tray before you, while the tea's steam rose. You looked at the newspaper's date, April 11th, 1912. It had been printed yesterday before leaving Southampton. The headline news was King George's new policies. But as you flipped through the pages, you glanced at the sports news. When you bit into the croissant, its crunch echoed in your ear. It was fresh, as if just out of the oven. The valet opened the curtains. Outside the window, endless blue sea stretched. The sky was clear. The sun sparkled. The waves rippled gently. After finishing your breakfast, you went to the bathroom. While washing at the marble sink, you looked at yourself in the mirror. There was a rested expression on your face. After shaving, the valet had already prepared the day's clothes. A comfortable suit for morning, another suit for afternoon, tuxedo for evening. First-class passengers changed clothes at least 3 times a day, because each time had its own rules. While dressing, the valet helped you tie your tie. Your shoes were gleaming. They had probably been polished throughout the night. When you left the cabin, morning silence reigned in the corridor. Most passengers hadn't woken yet, because last night entertainment had continued until late hours. You, however, loved waking early. You wanted to explore the ship in the first hours of the day. When you went up to a deck, the open air greeted you. The sea breeze hit your face. Salty air filled your lungs. The deck's wooden floor creaked under your feet. When you started walking, you noticed the ship's enormous size once again. Going from one end of the deck to the other took almost 5 minutes. Along the way, you saw several passengers lying on deck chairs, wrapped in thick blankets. They were reading newspapers. An elderly lady greeted you from under her large hat. You responded, smiling. When you came to the ship's bow, the wind was blowing a bit harder. When you looked down, you saw the giant prow cutting through the waters. White foam was rippling along the ship's sides. During your morning walk, you met other first-class passengers. A couple from Philadelphia had gone to Europe for their honeymoon. Now they were returning to America. How the man embraced his wife. How the woman laughed. A sweet feeling passed through you. A bit further, you encountered an English noble. He was Lord something, but you couldn't quite understand his title. He talked about the weather, the ship's speed, last night's dinner. Everyone was pleased with everything. There wasn't a single person complaining. Toward 10 o'clock, you decided to go to the gymnasium, located on D-deck in the ship's middle section. This hall was incredibly modern for that era. When you entered, electric equipment appeared before you. Treadmill, bicycle, rowing machine, punching bag. All were made of shiny metal and polished wood. The hall's manager was a physical education teacher in white uniform. He showed how to use them. When you got on the treadmill, the machine started working. The surface under your feet was moving, but you were staying in place. Strange but fun. After exercising for 15 minutes, you had sweated. You went to the changing room. There were showers here. After washing with fresh water, you put on clean clothes. As you left the gymnasium, you saw the squash court. 2 gentlemen were playing a match. The sound of rackets was hitting the walls. You stopped to watch. You knew the game, but had never tried it. When the match ended, one of the players turned to you, asked if you wanted to try. You accepted because you didn't want to miss this opportunity. Playing squash turned out harder than you thought. The ball was fast. As it hit the walls, it came back at unpredictable angles. Your opponent was experienced. He beat you easily, but it was still fun. When the game ended, you shook his hand, thanked him like a gentleman. He also smiled and said, you could play again tomorrow. When you left the court, noon was approaching. Your stomach was feeling slight hunger. For lunch, you decided to go to Café Parisien. located on B deck on the ship's starboard side. This cafe was one of Titanic's newest features. When you entered, a completely different world appeared before you. Wicker tables and chairs, ivy decorations on the walls, artificial plants hanging from the ceiling. It made you feel as if you had entered a street cafe in Paris. You could watch the sea from the large windows. Young passengers had gathered at the cafe. Most were newly married couples. You sat at a table and looked at the menu. Café Parisien shared the same menu with a la carte restaurant, but the atmosphere was much more relaxed and cheerful. There were light meals, sandwiches, salads, omelets, desserts. You ordered a salmon sandwich with lemonade. When the waiter brought it, the bread was fresh, the salmon looked pink and delicious. The lemonade was served in an iced glass. When you took the first sip, the coolness went down your throat. While eating, you listened to conversations at the next table. Two young women were discussing dresses from last night's dinner. One was praising the other's necklace. At the opposite table, three gentlemen were talking business. They were discussing stock market movements in New York. The couple by the window were just looking at each other, smiling silently. Love was floating in the air. Perhaps this was the magic of this journey. After lunch, you wanted to go to the library. The first-class library was decorated in classic English style. Dark wooden shelves, leather-bound books, comfortable chairs. When you entered, there was slight silence. A few people were reading books. Some were flipping through newspapers. You browsed the shelves. Dickens, Shakespeare, Wilde, classics alongside new novels were there. You took an Arthur Conan Doyle book. You loved Sherlock Holmes stories. You sat in a chair and started reading. While getting lost among the pages, you didn't notice how time passed. Sunlight was coming from the library's large window. It was illuminating the pages. Occasionally, you raised your head and looked at the sea. You seemed lost in infinite blueness. No land was visible anywhere around. Only water, sky, white clouds. Being in the middle of the ocean was a strange feeling. It made you feel both free and isolated. In the late afternoon hours, you decided to go to the Turkish bath. Located on F deck, this facility was specially prepared for first-class passengers. When you entered, warmth enveloped you. Steam room, hot water pools, massage tables, Oriental-style tiles were worked into the walls. You put on your bathrobe and went to the steam room. Moisture and heat were relaxing your muscles. There were a few other passengers, but no one was talking. They were just resting silently. When you came out of the bath, it was past 5 o'clock. It was time to return to the cabin because you needed to prepare for dinner. While walking in the corridor, you also saw other passengers returning to their cabins the same way. Everyone would wear their best clothes for the evening because this was the day's most important social activity. When you entered your cabin, the valet had already prepared the tuxedo. He had chosen a red tie. He said colors needed to shine in the evening. While washing and dressing, you evaluated yourself in the mirror. The tuxedo fit perfectly. The tie was properly tied. Your shoes gleamed like mirrors. You combed your hair, splashed some cologne. When you were ready, it was 7:15. Dinner would start at 8, but it was customary to first go to the lounge and chat with other passengers. When you went to the first-class lounge, the hall was beginning to fill. Women were in magnificent evening dresses, silk fabrics, pearls, diamonds. Men wore tuxedos and were puffing cigars. Waiters were carrying champagne on trays. You took a glass. Bubbles were rising inside. At the first sip, a slightly sour taste covered your palate. It was French champagne, the finest quality. While walking around the hall, you encountered familiar faces. The man you played squash with in the morning greeted you. The couple from Philadelphia recognized you. The elderly lady familiar from the library. nodded politely. In a music corner, piano was being played. Light melody filled the hall. People were chatting in small groups. Some about politics, some about fashion, some about the ship's magnificence. At 8 o'clock, a bell rang. The call to dinner came. Everyone walked toward the dining room. Like last night, the hall was shining. Crystal chandeliers, white-clothed tables, silver settings. Everything was in place. When you sat at your table, you met the other passengers beside you. On your right sat a banker family from New York. On your left, a lawyer couple from London. Conversation would continue throughout the evening. When the menu came, there were 10 different meal options. For first plate, oysters, then salmon fumé, consommé soup. For main course, you could choose between lamb chops, filet, duck. As garnish, there was spinach, potatoes, carrots. Among desserts was soufflé, ice cream, fruit salad. The wine menu was separate. Wines brought from France's best vineyards were listed. When the meal began, the orchestra started playing. String instruments, piano, violin. Melody filled the dining room. Oysters came on ice. Fresh sea smell reached your nose. When you added lemon drops and swallowed, salty taste remained in your mouth. Salmon fumé was creamy, light. Consommé soup was hot, delicious. Between each plate, conversations continued. The banker was talking about the economic situation in America. The lawyer was discussing legal reforms in England. The banker's wife was describing Paris fashions. The lamb chops were perfectly cooked, outside browned, inside remained pink. Potatoes were sautéed in butter. Spinach was creamy. Your wine glass was always full. Waiters were constantly circulating. Breads were fresh. Butter was from Denmark. Salts were in special crystal containers. Everything was flawless. It couldn't be taken one step further. For dessert came chocolate soufflé. When you inserted the spoon, the hot chocolate inside flowed. The flavor melted on your palate. After coffee service, men moved again to their own lounge. While cigar smoke rose in the air, whiskeys were drunk. As the night progressed, conversations deepened. Some started playing poker. Some played billiards. You, however, sat in a chair watching around. This world was so far from real life. But now, you were right in the middle. When midnight approached, you returned to the cabin. The following days would also pass with similar routine. Every morning, new discoveries. Every afternoon, rest. Every evening, magnificent feasts. The days of the 12th and 13th of April also flowed in the same luxury, with the same peace. The sea was calm, the weather beautiful. Everyone was happy. Titanic was accomplishing a perfect voyage. Chapter 3. The Last Day and Signs of Danger. On the morning of April 14th, 1912, you woke with sunlight filtering through the window curtains. When you glanced at the clock at your bedside, you saw it was 7:15. As usual, the valet came with the breakfast tray, but today there was a different expression on his face. He looked a bit tense. While placing the tray before you, he indicated he wanted to say something with permission. You began listening with curiosity. He explained that several iceberg warnings had come to the telegraph room throughout the night. The ship's route had been slightly shifted south. He added, there was nothing to worry about, but the tremor in his voice made you uneasy while having your breakfast. You thought about this information. Icebergs. Yes, they were quite common in the North Atlantic in April. But could they pose a danger to a ship like Titanic? It seemed impossible, because in last night's conversations in the lounge, everyone had talked about the ship's unsinkability. It had 16 watertight compartments. Even if 4 were damaged at once, it could float. You shook your head. No need to exaggerate. Finishing your croissant and sipping your tea, you glanced at the newspaper's sports pages. When you dressed and went up to the deck, you immediately noticed the weather had changed. It was much colder than previous days. When you breathed, steam came out. The sea, however, was incredibly calm. It was like a mirror. There were no waves, no wind blowing. The water's surface stretched so flat it perfectly reflected the sky. This extraordinary silence was actually disturbing, because it didn't seem natural. When you approached the deck's edge, you looked down. Even the foam created by the ship's prow was immediately disappearing. During your morning walk, you encountered several passengers. Everyone was complaining about the weather's coldness. Thick coats were worn, scarves wrapped, gloves put on. A lady was holding her hat to keep it from being caught by the wind, but there wasn't even wind. While laughing, cold air stabbed into your lungs. When you walked toward the bow, you saw Captain Edward Smith. He stood on the bridge, scanning the horizon with binoculars. The first officer was beside him. They were talking seriously. They didn't even notice your presence. Toward noon, you went to the lounge. Inside was warm. The fireplace was burning. Other passengers were drinking coffee, reading newspapers, playing backgammon. You sat in a chair and started watching around. Conversations were as usual. Politics, stock market, fashion. No one was talking about danger, but a rumor reached your ear. The operators responsible for the telegraph room had been busy since morning. Messages of ice warnings were constantly coming from other ships. Garonia, Baltic, America, Mesaba. All were reporting the same thing. There are large icebergs on our route. You ate lunch in the dining room. As always, it was a magnificent meal. But today, you didn't have much appetite. You were a bit tense. You looked at the people around you. Everyone was cheerful, laughing, joking. Maybe you were just exaggerating. After all, the ship was so big. How could an iceberg harm it? It was illogical. You finished your meal and withdrew to the library. You wanted to read a book. In a quiet corner, you spent the afternoon hours reading. Sherlock Holmes's detective adventure had drawn you into the story. While getting lost among the pages, you were forgetting the world outside. Occasionally you raised your head and looked out the window. The sea was still like a mirror. The sky was clear. No clouds. The sun was beginning to set. The horizon was painted with orange, pink, purple tones. The view was breathtakingly beautiful, but the unease inside you wasn't passing. Around 5 o'clock, you returned to your cabin. You needed to prepare for dinner. The valet had prepared everything. Tuxedo pressed, shoes shiny, tie selected. While washing, you looked at yourself in the bathroom mirror. There were traces of fatigue on your face. The last few days had been very intense, constantly socializing, constantly talking, constantly smiling. It was tiring, actually. But tonight would be the last dinner. Tomorrow morning, when you arrived in New York, this magnificent journey would end. While dressing, the valet began talking. He mentioned the ship's speed. They hadn't slowed down even today. They were moving at 21 knots per hour, not to break a record, but to arrive on time. It was White Star Line's rule. The schedule had to be followed. You nodded. It made sense. After all, passengers expected to arrive in New York on a certain date. Delay was unacceptable. When you descended to the hall for dinner, the crowd was larger than usual. Everyone was experiencing the excitement of the last night. Women wore their most beautiful dresses, put on their most valuable jewels. Men were showy in their tuxedos. While champagne was drunk in the lounge, conversations rose. Music was playing. Laughter echoed. The atmosphere was cheerful. When the transition to the dining room began, everyone took their place. When you sat at your table, you called the waiter. You asked if a special menu had been prepared tonight. The waiter smiled and handed you the menu. There were 11 different dishes. First plate oysters, then salmon fumet, consommé Olga soup, then filet mignon lily, chicken lyonnaise, lamb with mint sauce, duck with orange sauce. Among garnishes were boiled potatoes, creamed carrots, green peas, rice. For dessert, Waldorf pudding, chocolate eclairs, French ice cream, Stilton cheese. The wine list was impressive. Chateau Latour, 1899. Moet and Chandon champagne. Burgundy red wine. Porto wine. Different wine would accompany each dish. While your eyes traveled on the menu, your stomach growled. You were hungry, actually. You ordered oysters. The waiter took your note, moved away smiling. When the orchestra started playing, the hall came alive. The sound of string instruments was reflecting from the ceilings. The banker family on your right was happy to be returning to America. The lawyer couple on your left said they would miss England. At the opposite table sat an elderly countess. She wore a tiara. Diamonds sparkled. She had created such an atmosphere around herself that everyone looked at her with respect. When the oysters came, fresh sea smell filled your nose. When you added lemon and swallowed, salty taste filled your palate. Each bite was the taste of the ocean. Salmon fumet was creamy, light. Consommé soup was hot, delicious. Between each plate, conversations continued. The banker was talking about new investment opportunities in America. The lawyer was describing political tensions in Europe. The countess was remembering balls in Paris. For the main course you chose, filet mignon. When the meat came, it was perfectly cooked, outside browned, inside remained pink. It was soft under the knife. It melted in your mouth. The wine was red, velvety, rich in aroma. With each sip, you were discovering new flavors. Potatoes were buttery, carrots were sweet, peas were crunchy. As the meal progressed, the hall became even livelier. Laughter increased, conversations rose, glasses clinked. Everyone wanted to fully live the last night, because tomorrow this magic would end. When you arrived at New York Harbor, real life would start again. But now, at this moment, you were all at the pinnacle of the world. When dessert service came, you chose Waldorf pudding. Creamy, fruity, light. Chocolate ice cream also came. Rich, dense, delicious. Stilton cheese was served with coffee. The sharp taste of the cheese perfectly harmonized with the bitterness of the coffee. At the end of the meal, your stomach was satisfied, but your spirit was fulfilled. When men moved to the lounge, it was approaching 10 o'clock. Captain Edward Smith had also come. A group had gathered around him. While puffing a cigar, he was talking about the ship's performance. It had been a perfect voyage. No problems had occurred. They would arrive in New York on time tomorrow morning. He looked proud, but there was slight tension in his eyes. Perhaps it was fatigue. You also took a cigar. When you inhaled the smoke, your throat burned. But then you got used to it. You sipped your whiskey. A gentleman next to you talked about the ship's icebergs. During the night, there were watchmen in the lookout tower. They constantly scanned ahead with their binoculars. If they saw ice, they would immediately notify the bridge. The ship's route would be changed. Simple procedure. No need to worry. You relaxed, So everything was under control. Professionals were doing their job. You should just enjoy yourself. You finished your whiskey and took a second glass. When alcohol started circulating in your veins, you relaxed. You listened to the conversations around you. Politics, business, sports. Everything was being discussed. When it passed 11 o'clock, the hall slowly began emptying. Elderly passengers were withdrawing to their cabins. You too were tired. You extinguished the pipe and stood up. You left saying goodnight to a few acquaintances. Silence reigned in the corridor. Light no longer seeped from many cabins. Everyone had slept. When you entered your cabin, the valet had already made preparations. Bed opened, pajamas placed, sink cleaned, covers straightened. You took off your tuxedo. You washed in the bathroom. You put on your pajamas. When you lay in bed, fatigue enveloped your body. Your eyes began growing heavy. You looked out the window one last time. There was only darkness. No moon. Stars, very bright. The air had gotten very cold. You drew the curtain. When you put your head on the pillow, the ship's slight swaying calmed you. Soon, you would fall asleep. Tomorrow morning, you would be in New York Harbor. This magnificent journey would end, but you didn't know that in an hour, everything would change. At 11:40 p.m., Watchman Frederick Fleet would see something in the dark water. The bell would ring. He would shout to the bridge, "Iceberg right ahead." But it would already be too late. Titanic's fate would be sealed. Your eyes closed. You slept. Chapter 4. Collision and Chaos. A strange sound coming from somewhere deep woke you from sleep. When you opened your eyes, you were looking at the cabin ceiling. For a moment you couldn't understand what had happened. You listened carefully, but there was no more sound. Maybe it was a dream. You put your head back on the pillow, but something had changed. That regular humming of the ship's engines you were accustomed to had stopped. There was silence. Disturbing silence. After getting out of bed, you looked at your watch. 20 minutes to midnight. Still very late. When you approached the window, you parted the curtain. Outside was pitch dark, but the stars were incredibly bright. The sea stood like a mirror. There was no rippling. You noticed something strange. There were people walking on deck. At this hour, you put on your bathrobe with curiosity. When you opened the door, several more passengers appeared in the corridor. They had come out of their doors in pajamas and bathrobes. An elderly gentleman came out of the adjacent cabin. There was confusion on his face. He asked if something had happened. You said you didn't know. You walked together toward the end of the corridor. When you approached the stairs, sounds started coming from above. People were talking. Some were laughing. When you went up to the deck, an interesting scene appeared before you. Dozens of passengers were wandering in bathrobes over their coats. Some were joking, with whiskey glasses in hand. There was no atmosphere of panic. When you stepped onto the ship's deck, cold air hit you. When you breathed, your lungs burned. The temperature was below zero. You started shivering, but you continued forward to understand what was happening around. On chairs, railings, deck, there were white things. When you approached, you saw they were ice pieces. Small ice was scattered everywhere. A passenger was holding an ice piece. "Look what I found," he was saying. Those around were laughing. When you walked toward the ship's bow, the crowd began increasing. Everyone wanted to see ahead. One of the watchmen said they had collided with a large iceberg, but it wasn't a problem. They had only grazed it. There was no damage to the ship. Soon, they would continue on their way. You relaxed, so it was just a minor accident. You looked at the people around. Everyone was calm. In fact, some were having fun. A lady was posing with the ice piece in her hand. But the unease inside you wasn't passing. Why weren't the engines running? Why had the ship stopped completely? If they had only grazed, why weren't they moving? Questions were spinning in your mind. You looked around once more. Some passengers were already starting to return to their cabins. The cold was unbearable, but you decided to wait. Something was going wrong. You felt it. After 10 minutes passed, activity began on deck. The crew started rushing. Officers were going to the sections where lifeboats were located. Ropes were being untied. Boats were being checked. Your heart accelerated. Was this just routine procedure, or was there really danger? You approached an officer. You asked what was happening. The man answered hurriedly. The captain had ordered. Boats would be prepared. It was a precautionary measure. No need to worry. You returned to your cabin. Maybe you should get your valuables. When you entered, you found the valet. The man was quickly gathering things in the wardrobes. His face was pale. His hands were trembling. When he saw you, he stopped. "Sir, we need to pack," he said. There was panic in his voice. "Was there a problem on the ship?" you asked. The man hesitated. Then he spoke in a low voice. Water was entering. In the lower decks, it was spreading rapidly. Engineers were trying to stop it, but you froze. Water was entering? Into Titanic? It was impossible. This ship was famous for its unsinkability. It had 16 watertight compartments. Even if 4 filled, it would float. But the fear in the valet's eyes was real. He wasn't lying. You moved quickly. You opened the wardrobe. Money, documents, your watch, your ring. You stuffed everything into your pockets. You put on your coat. You put on your hat. You put on your gloves. You were ready. The valet brought the life jacket. He showed how to wear it. You slipped it over your shoulders. He tied the straps. It was a thick thing filled with cork. It looked cumbersome, but maybe it could save your life. You looked in the mirror. You looked strange. Coat over orange life jacket. But you didn't care anymore. Surviving was important. When you went out to the corridor, chaos had begun. Families were rushing out of their cabins. Children were crying. Women were stuffing valuables into their bags. Men were trying to calm their wives. Crew members were walking in the corridors, telling everyone to put on life jackets. But there was still no panic. There was controlled activity. When you went up to the deck, it was 25 past midnight. The air had gotten very cold. More passengers had now gathered. Hundreds of people were wandering on deck. Lifeboats were ready. The crew had started untying ropes. But the boats were small, very small. How could they carry the 2,000 people on the ship? An officer started shouting. Women and children first. Men stand back. Families started separating from each other. Women were crying. Men were trying to get their wives into boats. Children were clinging to their parents. These were heartbreaking scenes. Even on first-class deck, tears were flowing. You stood in a corner watching. Around you were other men. All were doing the same thing, waiting. Women and children would go first. This was the rule. It required being a gentleman. But fear was rising inside you. What if there weren't enough boats? What if the ship sank before your turn came? Minutes passed. Boats were being prepared, but none had been lowered yet. The crew was checking, arranging ropes, taking safety precautions. Some women were hesitating, seemed undecided about staying or leaving the ship. The cold was unbearable. Some passengers were returning to their cabins to get thicker clothes. At 1:45, the orchestra came up to the deck. 8 musicians were carrying their instruments. Violin, viola, cello, piano. They prepared their musical instruments. Then they started playing soothing melodies, dance music, cheerful songs. They were playing to lift people's spirits, but no one was dancing. Everyone was distressed. You saw an acquaintance. John Jacob Astor, America's richest man. He was trying to get his pregnant wife, Madeline, into a lifeboat. The woman didn't want to leave her husband. She was crying. Astor was trying to calm her, telling her to get in the boat. He would come later. Madeline finally agreed, but the boat hadn't been lowered yet. Preparations were continuing. Other families were experiencing similar scenes. Benjamin Guggenheim hadn't put on a coat. He stood in his tuxedo. He was saying he wanted to die like a gentleman. His valet was beside him. Both were calm. They seemed to have surrendered. They were helping women passengers board boats. They themselves were waiting. Finally, around 12:45 a.m., the first lifeboat started being lowered. Ropes creaked. The boat was slowly descending. Inside were 25 to 30 women. Several crew members had also boarded to row. When the boat touched the water, ropes were untied. Oars started being pulled. It slowly moved away from the ship. It disappeared into darkness. Second, third, fourth boats were being prepared, but the process was very slow. Each boat taking down 15 to 20 minutes. At this rate, it would last until morning. Did the ship have that much time? You looked around. The ship had started tilting slightly. The bow had descended a bit, so water was entering. Slowly but surely, you were still waiting. Would your turn come? It was uncertain. Boats were filling, but there were still hundreds of people on deck. Mathematically, it was impossible. There wasn't room for everyone. When you understood this reality, fear enveloped your entire body. Maybe you would die tonight. Maybe you would end in the cold Atlantic waters. But you wouldn't give up. You would fight to survive. You fixed your eyes on the boats. You would seize every opportunity. After women and children boarded, if there was room left, you would board. No one could stop you. Toward 1 o'clock, the ship's tilt became more pronounced. Now it was being felt. Standing on deck was starting to become difficult. Your feet were slipping. You needed to hold on to railings. People around you had also noticed. Panic was slowly increasing. Voices were rising. Crying was multiplying. Shouts were heard. New passengers started coming up from lower decks. Third-class passengers. Hundreds of immigrants were climbing up. The doors had been closed, but they had been forced open. Now all were flooding onto deck. Children, elderly, women, men. All were looking for life jackets. All wanted to be saved. As the crowd increased, chaos grew. There was no longer order. Everyone wanted to board a boat. The crew was trying to control it, but couldn't keep up. Some boats were being lowered half full. Some were being overloaded. Confusion was at its peak. You continued watching for an opportunity. Your eyes traveled over the boats. Your heart was beating. Your breathing had accelerated. You were at the most critical moment of your life. You had to make a decision. Would you wait here for your turn? Or would you try to board a boat somehow? Time was narrowing. The ship was sinking. You needed to make a choice. Chapter 5. The last hours and the end. When it passed 1 o'clock, the ship's tilt had really started becoming pronounced. Walking straight on deck was now difficult, because as Titanic's bow slowly sank into the water, the stern was rising toward the sky. The chaos around you was growing with each passing minute. Hundreds of people were desperately pushing to board lifeboats, some crying, some shouting, some silently praying. The orchestra was still playing, but the melody no longer sufficed to provide consolation. The determination on the musicians' faces was the calm of people who had accepted death. When you walked toward a lifeboat, an officer from the crew blocked your way. He raised his hand, indicating you should stop. "Women and children first, sir," he said in a firm but controlled voice. You had to step back. When you looked around, about 15 more men like you were waiting. Some were smoking, some silently watching the ship sink, some rubbing their hands trying to protect against the cold. The same fear, the same uncertainty, the same helplessness was red in their eyes. You were all sharing the same fate, but no one was speaking loudly. As it approached 1:30, a new wave of people started rising from lower decks. Third-class passengers had finally been able to come up because the doors keeping them below had either been forced open or finally released by the crew. But it was too late. Now families were running up to deck. Children were screaming in their parents' arms. Elderly were trying to walk, clinging to their grandchildren. For most, there were no more lifeboats left. This reality was red on their faces. Hopelessness, fear, panic. At the bow deck, the last 2 boats were being prepared. The crew was working extremely urgently because the ship's sinking speed had increased. Women were trying to get in line, but order had now completely broken down. Some men were also trying to climb into the boat by mixing among the women. Officers were trying to prevent it. Some were hurling curses. Some were pushing. Just then, an officer drew his pistol and fired into the air. The boom shook the entire deck. Everyone froze for a moment. Voices stopped. Movements halted. Then, as if nothing had happened, chaos began again. People again started pushing, shouting, trying to climb into boats. You stood on the side, watching everything. The hope inside you was now really starting to diminish. Boats were rapidly running out, but there were still hundreds of people waiting on deck. Even a simple mathematical calculation showed there wasn't room for everyone. When this reality started echoing in your mind, a shiver enveloped your entire body. Maybe you could die tonight. Maybe you could never see your family again. Maybe this magnificent, glorious journey had turned into a death journey for you. When the last boat in the second row started being lowered, something stirred inside you. The time for following gentlemen's rules had passed. You wanted to survive. You approached. You tried to pass through the crowd. You reached the boat's edge. You prepared to jump. Just then, one of the crew grabbed your arm firmly. He pulled you back. "No, sir," he said, angrily. "Women and children first." You thought of resisting, but the determination on his face deterred you. You had to step back. The anger, disappointment, fear inside you mixed together. The boat started descending. Inside were about 30 women. Some were crying, some were waving to their husbands remaining above. Some were tightly embracing the children in their laps. Ropes creaked. The boat was slowly lowering toward the dark sea. When it touched the water, ropes were untied. The crew started rowing. The boat slowly moved away from the ship. It disappeared into darkness. Now you could only hear the sound of oars. As it approached 2 o'clock, the last boat also started being prepared. This time, you were more determined. You needed to survive. You approached. You plunged into the crowd. You pushed. You forced. Officers tried to prevent it, but they could no longer control it, because dozens of men were doing the same thing. Some succeeded, jumped into the boat. You also prepared to jump. You reached out your hand. You lifted your foot. But just then, someone pushed you from behind. You lost balance. You fell to the deck. When you got up, the boat was already full. It had started being lowered. You reached out your hand again, but couldn't hold on. The boat descended. It disappeared before your eyes. There were no more lifeboats left. Panic on deck reached its final point. Now there was no way of rescue for hundreds of people. Some started climbing toward the ship's stern, because the bow had sunk well into the water. The ship's tilt was now so pronounced that standing was becoming almost impossible. You needed to hold on to railings, masts, ropes, everything. Some people couldn't endure and started jumping into the sea. When they fell into the water at -2 degrees temperature, the screams they emitted scratched your ears. But still, it seemed like a better choice than staying on the ship. The orchestra was playing its last melodies. 8 musicians, clinging to their instruments, were performing the final notes with trembling hands. The hymn, "Nearer My God to Thee," was slowly rising. Some passengers were accompanying them, singing tremblingly. Voices were spreading as if challenging the darkness, the cold, death, crying, prayers. Songs had turned into a symphony mixed together. You stood on the ship's middle deck thinking about what to do. Should you stay on the ship, or should you jump into the sea? Both choices seemed deadly. Staying on the ship meant being pulled down with the sinking. Jumping into the sea meant dying by freezing. But you had to make a decision, because time was rapidly running out. The ship could sink completely in minutes. You thought for a few minutes. Then you made your decision. You would jump into the sea because at least you might have a chance to hold onto a piece of wreckage. Maybe you could endure until morning. Maybe a rescue ship would come. It was a very small possibility, but it was better than nothing. You walked toward the railing. Walking was very difficult due to the tilt. You were slipping, holding on, moving forward again. You finally reached the railing. When you looked down, the dark water appeared very far away. It was frightening, but there was no other choice left. Just as you were about to jump, a terrible shock occurred on the ship. All the lights flickered, flared, then went out. The electric generators had finally been submerged in water. The time was exactly 2:18 a.m. The ship suddenly plunged into pitch darkness. Only the faint light of stars remained. Screams intensified. People were bumping into each other in the darkness, falling, losing balance. Chaos had now taken on an uncontrollable form. You were trying to find balance in the darkness when your eyes slowly started getting used to the dark. You started distinguishing around. The ship's bow was now almost completely underwater. The stern, however, was starting to tilt toward the sky. The ship was rising at a striking angle. Now standing straight was completely impossible. You were slipping. Everything was being dragged down. You were trying to hold on, but the tilt was too much. At 2:20 a.m., suddenly, a terrible sound was heard. Metal breaking, explosions roaring, the giant structure creaking. The ship was starting to break in two. It was cracking from the middle section. The front section and rear section were separating from each other. People screamed in horror. Many fell into the sea. You also lost the mast you were holding. You slipped. You were dragged toward the railing. You hit something hard. You felt pain. But in panic, you didn't let go. You held on to something else. The ship's front section rapidly sank into the water. It was seen for a few more seconds on the waves. Then, it was completely pulled down. It sank toward the ocean bottom. It vanished. The rear section, however, remained tilted for a while longer. It was almost vertical. Hundreds of people on it were screaming, trying to hold on. But the ship was losing balance. It was swaying. It slowly started tilting backward. There was nowhere left to hold on. You released your hands. You tried to run, but the ground was so tilted that running was impossible. You slipped. You passed over the ship's side. You fell into emptiness. It seemed like you remained suspended in the air for a few seconds. Time had slowed. Then you violently hit the water. The first moment your body went into shock. The coldness was so sharp, so painful, that you couldn't breathe. Your lungs contracted. You wanted to scream, but couldn't make a sound. Panic enveloped your entire body. You were underwater. You couldn't see upward. You no longer knew which direction was up, which direction was down. You thrashed. You waved your arms frantically. You kicked your legs. Thanks to your life jacket, you were slowly pulled upward. A few seconds later, your head emerged at the water surface. You took a deep breath. The air was so cold it burned your lungs, but you didn't care. You were alive. You looked around. It was dark. Hundreds of people were thrashing in the water. Screams were deafening your ears. Calls for help. Crying, shouting. But no one could help anyone, because everyone was experiencing the same horror. The ship's rear section was still visible. It was slowly sinking. There were still people on it. They were holding on until the last moment. But as the ship was submerged in water, they too were dragged with their screams. The time was exactly 2:20 a.m. RMS Titanic had completely sunk. The world's largest ship had collapsed to the bottom of the Atlantic. You were trying to stay in the water. Your life jacket was keeping you afloat, but the cold was unbearable. The water temperature was -2 degrees. Your body had started going numb within seconds. You could no longer feel your fingers. You couldn't feel your feet. Your face was going numb. You couldn't speak. Even breathing was painful. Around you, wreckage. Pieces were floating. Wooden pieces, chair fragments, door remnants. A bit further away, you saw a large wooden piece. You tried to swim, but your arms were very heavy. You slowly approached. You held onto the wood. You tried to climb on top, but there was no strength left in your hands. You slipped. You tried again. This time, you managed to pull half your body onto the wood. Your other half was still in the water, but still it was better than nothing. The screams around you slowly started decreasing. The cold was killing people within minutes. Within 10 minutes, most fell silent. After 20 minutes, almost no sound remained. Only the water's slight lapping sound, a distant wave sound. The wind's whistle were heard. Death's silence had descended. Hundreds of people had died freezing in the water. You were still holding on. You had clung tightly to the wood. You were determined not to let go. You wouldn't die. You would endure. You would see morning. A rescue ship would come. It definitely would come. This thought was keeping you upright, but your body was no longer under your control. The cold was starting to win. Your body stopped shivering. This was a bad sign, because hypothermia was progressing. Your organs were slowly losing their functions. Your brain was freezing. Your eyes started closing. You couldn't fight anymore. You were very tired, very cold. You wanted to let go. You wanted to sleep. You wanted to be free from all pain. You slowly started loosening your hands. You started slipping from the wood. You were being pulled toward the water. You weren't resisting. You were surrendering. Maybe this way was easier. The pain wouldn't stop. You would just fall into a comfortable sleep. Forever. But just then, a sound was heard from afar. Was it an engine sound? Were you hallucinating? You listened carefully. Yes, sound was coming. It was approaching. It was real. A ship was approaching. You gathered your last strength. You tried to shout, but no sound came out. You tried to wave your arm, but it didn't move. But you clung tightly to the wood again. You waited. The sound came even closer. Lights appeared. A ship was coming. It was RMS Carpathia. It had received Titanic's distress call, was coming for 4 hours passing through icebergs. The time was approaching 4 in the morning. The sky was slowly starting to lighten. The ship reached the wreckage area. Searchlights were turned on. Powerful beams started scanning the water. It was finding lifeboats one by one. It was taking people aboard the ship. One of the searchlights turned toward you. Light hit your face. The crew on the ship saw you. A boat was immediately lowered into the water. The boat started rapidly approaching you. Crew members were calling to you, telling you to endure. When the boat finally came beside you, they reached out their hands. They grasped your frozen fingers. They started pulling you from the wood. Your body was so heavy, they almost couldn't lift you. But they didn't give up. They slowly took you into the boat. You were saved. You had survived. The miracle had happened. When you boarded Carpathia, there was no strength left in your legs. The crew immediately supported you, lifted you to the deck holding your arms. They brought thick blankets, wrapped them around you. An officer brought hot soup, tried to make you drink by pressing it to your lips. You were taken inside. The warmth inside the ship almost hurt, because your skin was frozen. After being placed in a berth, you lay down on a bed. Blankets were piled on top of you. You slowly started warming. Your body first went numb, then started tingling, finally started shivering. This was a good sign because your body had started working again, was trying to return to life. Hours later, when you opened your eyes, you were in Carpathia's berth. Around you were other survivors. Some wrapped in blankets were sleeping. Some were crying silently. Some were just staring at the ceiling. Everyone had the same expression in their eyes. Shock, disbelief, the guilt of surviving. You tried to sit up. Your body still ached, but you could move. You were alive. Even this was a miracle. When you closed your eyes, you saw Titanic, that magnificent ship, that glorious journey, that terrible end. The crystal chandeliers in the first-class dining room, the ivy decorations in Café Parisien, the wooden chairs on deck, that magnificent dinner of the last night, then that collision, boats, screams, icy water, death, silence. Everything was vivid in your mind. You would never forget. This night would follow you for the rest of your life. Carpathia was moving toward New York. It would be a 3-day journey. During this time, you talked with other survivors on the ship. Everyone had a story. Some had lost their family. Some had been miraculously saved. Some couldn't understand why they had survived. 705 people had been rescued. 1,500 people had died. These numbers were echoing in your mind. Each loss was a person, a life, a story. On the evening of April 18th, 1912, Carpathia approached New York Harbor. The harbor was crowded. Thousands of people were waiting at the wharf. Families were looking for their loved ones. Journalists were rushing after news. Curious onlookers were trying to see the event. As you approached the ship, you could hear the crowd's sound. Shouts, crying, names being called. When the ship docked, the gangway was lowered. Survivors started descending to shore. One by one, when your turn came, you walked to the gangway. Your legs were still trembling. Each step was difficult, but you were moving forward. When you descended to shore, you felt solid ground under your feet. Your knees almost buckled, but you pulled yourself together. You continued walking. You returned to life. You had received a second chance. When you looked around, New York's lights were shining. The city was living, continuing, didn't care. Titanic had sunk, but the world continued turning. You too would continue living. You would never forget this terrible night, but you would continue your life. Because you had survived. When you were about to take your last breath in that freezing water, when Carpathia's lights appeared, when those hands reached out and pulled you from the water, when warm blankets were wrapped around you, you had received a second chance. You wouldn't waste this chance. You would live. You would live on behalf of the 1,500 souls lost on Titanic. You would tell their story. You would never let that night be forgotten.